Good afternoon. My name's Alexandra King. I'm a member of the Nipissing First Nation, which is in Ontario. I happen to be one of 3 known physicians who are Indigenous working in the area of hepatitis C here in Canada. I have the honor of presenting today and the joy of co-authoring this presentation with Renee Mashing, an esteemed colleague and friend. We would really like to thank the organizers for including this important topic. And I would also like to take and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Kanyan-Kahaka people, and we're grateful to be able to meet here today. To begin, for those who don't know as much about Indigenous people here in Canada, I want to present a little bit of data. So what you have here are pie charts that are showing the actual number of Indigenous people in each province, as well as a percentage of the population. What you'll see is that in the Maritimes, we are fairly low, anywhere 1.6% up to about 3 or 4%. It is fairly low here in Quebec, less than 2%, and about 2.5% in Ontario. As you go further west in the prairies, it gets up into the mid-teens, and up in the north of Canada, the percentage of Indigenous people are much higher, just given the population there. Another thing that's really important to note is that actual numbers can be important. For example, Ontario actually has the highest number of Indigenous people in a province. The pie chart is showing the distribution of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people. So the majority of us are First Nations, whether or not the government recognizes us as such, making up about 70%. There's about 30% who are Métis, and then the remainder are Inuit. The population pyramids are on the right, and the rest of Canada are the blue, and you can see the typical baby boomer bulge, whereas the Indigenous people are in the yellow, and what you can see is that we're a very young population. And in point of fact, there is 46% of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people who are under the age of 25. This contrasts very much with the rest of Canada. In terms of hepatitis C statistics, there really isn't a lot available, and even less that has Indigenous identification. But what we do know is that there is the A-TRACK study, which shows very high prevalence rates, self-reported seropositivity among Indigenous people. And this is also echoed by I-TRACK. The other thing that you will note is that Indigenous women in particular have high rates, and you're seeing then the intersectionality of indigeneity, gender, and disease. The other thing that I think is becoming increasingly recognized is that this increased disease burden is being positioned within colonial policies and the end manifestation of many of these things. So the Indian residential schools were one such policy. There were about 150,000 Indigenous children who were in residential schools from the 1860s until 1996, when the last school was closed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission started having hearings back in 2008 and finished in 2014, I believe it was. They tabled their final report just at December 2015. And as part of their report, they put calls of action together, and a lot of them focused on child welfare, education, language and culture, as well as health. But I think it's really important to note that over 50 of their recommendations actually pertain to reconciliation. There is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in this document, there are 2 articles that actually pertain specifically to health. Article 24 is quite important because it indicates that Indigenous people have the right to health equity, and that you need significant leadership involvement and commitment in order to achieve this. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tabled their report in December 2015, Prime Minister Trudeau actually accepted the report and made a commitment to be implementing every one of the calls to action, including the signing of the UN DRIP. One of the things that is important to note is that when they're talking about reconciliation, they are talking about this as, sorry, I need some water. Thank you. The TRC recognizes this to be an ongoing individual and collective process. And this is something that needs to happen through a variety of legislation, policies, programs, research, and whatnot. And the fact that Trudeau has taken such a strong stance, I think that we're going to be seeing the implications of his decision over the coming years and even decades. In terms of Indigenous research methodologies, you usually will see these as plural because there are so many different Indigenous peoples throughout the world, and we have diverse knowledge systems and ways of knowing. Inherent to the Indigenous research methodologies tends to be a very strong commitment to community engagement and direction. And so therefore, we're not just talking about community-based research, but actually community-directed research and addressing their needs, their priorities. A lot of these research methodologies are, in fact, based on Indigenous worldviews, and in as much as they have their own axiology, epistemology, and ontology, they have methodological coherence. You will often see them placed within the rubric of social constructivism or critical theory, and they have really created not only their own body of methodologies, but they also have contributed a great deal to other areas. So as an example, if you're doing qualitative research, community-based research, participatory action research, I think you'll be aware of some of the contributions of scholars like Bonnie Duran and so on. So this is actually based on Indigenous philosophies. So what we have here are Western ways of knowing as well as Indigenous ways of knowing. And historically, these two spheres used to be quite separate. And what you're seeing now is, in fact, the coming together in an overlap. And the overlap area is really quite an exciting area because this is where we're coming up with novel ways of doing research. The other thing that I want to point out in this diagram is that I have put in a bigger circle, and that's to acknowledge the fact that while I'm interested in Indigenous ways of knowing and Western ways of knowing, there are many other knowledge systems on the planet. About, I guess it would have been mid-2000s, Mi'kmaq elder and scholar Albert Marshall came up with the notion of two-eyed seeing. And this is where he was looking at how do we work on improving Indigenous health. And he wanted us to be able to look through the strengths of Western ways of seeing things, also the strengths of Indigenous ways of seeing things, and then combining these visions together, these ways of knowing, so that way we would have the best of everything. And this is now something that I find has a lot of recognition within the research world. A lot of research proposals and articles that you're reading are now talking about two-eyed seeing. About the same time as Albert Marshall was talking about two-eyed seeing, there was another Indigenous elder and scholar, being Willie Ermine from Saskatchewan, who was actually talking about ethical space. And what he was saying is that when, in fact, you have two different societies coming together with their own ways of knowing, then what you need to do is negotiate the space in between where people can actually come together and have dialogue. And the whole point of this is so that way we could solve problems together. One of the things that I really like about ethical space is that part of what Willie Ermine was talking about was leveling the playing field. And so in point of fact, you have Western worldviews that tend to be privileged within our scientific community. And so they're at a level above Indigenous worldviews. And so in order for us to be able to be doing research together, then what we need to do is level the playing field in order to be able to create ethical space so that we can engage together. I actually think that in many ways, Willie Ermine's ways of looking at things are really going to be informing things as we move forward, and we're working on reconciliation and creating this space together. I want to give some examples of Indigenous research methodologies, and I was thinking about, first of all, with respect to two-eyed seeing, or a lot of times these are mixed method types of studies. So within the context of Hep C in particular, if you read some of the literature that has been produced by the CEDAR project, you'll see that a lot of times these are, in fact, mixed method. There's the Water Journey project, which my colleague Chris Macklin is going to be presenting next. And then there is a Peers for Wellness proposal that I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Curtis Cooper on developing. And this is looking at a peer navigation system. And again, it is bringing together a variety of different Western areas of expertise, including health economics and clinical skills and so on, as well as Indigenous ways of knowing. So I think it's very exciting times. In terms of other diseases, some of the other areas have actually had more Indigenous involvement and scholarship for a longer period of time. I'm involved in a suicide prevention study with the Vancouver Native Health Society, and it's called the Vancouver Indigenous Elders Project. The Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network has done some really fantastic research on HIV. There's 2 studies that I've put on here, alcohol use and the complexities of accessing care and treatment, as well as cultural concepts of care for Aboriginal people living with HIV and AIDS. There are many other studies as well. In terms of diabetes, Anthony Hanley, or Tony Hanley from the University of Toronto, has been working with the Sandy Lake Diabetes Project for over 2 decades now and really models two-eyed seeing. And you also have the work of Joanna Piscanu and Jim Dossman, who are doing respiratory health in Saskatchewan. And so you can see that there's a variety of different research projects that are going on as examples. With respect to epidemiological studies, it is really critical that we have data. I was listening to the previous presenter talking about Egypt, and it is absolutely critical that you have data so therefore you can be making informed policies and whatnot. I'm part of a group, the Indigenous group on, the International Group on Indigenous Health Measurement. And they have put forward some standards or best practices for Indigenous identifiers. And then here in Canada, we have both Janet Smiley or Brenda Elias who've done a lot of work on ways of doing this. It is important that we have proportional representation, and ideally to the extent of the disease burden. So if Indigenous people are making up 30% of hepatitis C, ideally then that would be reflected in the participant population. And then it's also important that you have Indigenous representation and voice throughout the research process as well as team. With respect to secondary data analysis, I've been involved in a project with MJ Malloy at the BC Centre where we're doing looking at access and VIDUS. There's also the Canadian cohort co-infection cohort that has a lot of Indigenous data, and then having a really thorough look at that. Another example that is something that we're just getting interested in here in Canada is this notion of biobanking or DNA on loan. And they're actually looking not only at the human DNA, but also at RNA and DNA of viruses. So things like HIV, hepatitis C, TB, the microbiome, and so on. And we actually have colleagues in Australia, New Zealand, and the US who have moved forward on this much faster than us. So this is a new area of research that I think is going to be opening up. That's the end of the presentation. I just want to again emphasize the fact that there is significant increased hepatitis C burden for Indigenous people here in Canada. There is community and people who are very interested in being involved in research and working with the great talent that's in this room. So thank you.